Okay. See, okay. I think we are now live. Welcome everyone to another edition of Subvisual Live Talks. After a brief period that we took some vacation, but we're back, and we're back with a good friend of mine, Portuguese. So I think we're back with a bang. I'd like to welcome to Subvisual Live Talks, Gonçalo. Hello, Gonçalo.
Hi, Zamith. Great to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for taking up this challenge. Hopefully, it won't be too hard. Yeah. So let's get going. So the first thing I like to start with always is to kind of give an idea of like where you came from as a person, as a developer, tech person. So what was your first experience with tech? When did you decide this was the thing for you?
These are different events. So I think my first experience with tech was a Sega Genesis Mega
Mm-hmm.
Drive. So I liked to play games, and my parents gave me a console. Uh, and I enjoyed playing, but I also enjoyed thinking about how games were made. How to break games was something that I enjoyed doing at the time. Um, so I didn't really know that was a job or think about it in those terms, but I remember being very fond of this. And gaming was something that I continued to do for a very long time. I still try to do it today, although life moves on and there's less time for everything.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but technology, more specifically about computers, came much later. So my family was generally frugal. My mom was an economist. My dad was a journalist. So they didn't have a use for a computer at home. So I was a late user of a computer. And actually, the story here is when I was about 10, 11,
Mm-hmm.
we didn't have a computer. And a friend of my parents was a network engineer. And when we were at his place, I would do stuff. I don't exactly recall what I did, but I would change his network configuration. And he would usually say, like, for a kid without a computer, Gonçalo surely is interested in this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So eventually they did get a computer. And that's, I think, when my interest really spiked. So we didn't really have internet to begin with, but I was fond of programming in C by
Mm-hmm.
copying code manually from a book and building terminal programs.
Mm-hmm.
Stupid programs like question and answer programs, yes or no programs. So they were very, very basic, very poorly done,
Mm-hmm.
but they worked, and I was fascinated to be able to do this. At some point, we got internet at home, and again, like my family was generally frugal. So, and my mom, being an economist, was very keen on like teaching us the value of money and how to manage money. So we didn't get a lot of money to spend on a day-to-day basis. So one of the first things I did when I got an internet connection was, I don't know if you remember those sites where you could earn money by watching ads.
No.
There was a thing there was a thing like this. Like you would stare at an ad for 30 seconds, you would get like 1 cent, then you would do another ad,
Mm-hmm.
another 30 cents. And I remember writing a bot in Visual Basic in Windows to watch ads for me. And the reason I did this on the operating system level was because I got banned a few times for using browser functions. So I was using OS functions so that the browser couldn't
Mm-hmm.
detect as easily that it was not a person, and actually made quite a bit of a buck with this and was quite happy. And I think by that time, I was pretty sure that I wanted to do this. I was having a lot of fun. Uh, it even made me money, so I was like not counting as much. Um, and I remember this extended further, like with the internet. I remember using there was this malware thing that was quite popular. I think NetBus or something that you could install in the computer and then operate it remotely from somewhere else, like open the CD drive and
Mm-hmm.
things like this. And I remember using this to freak people
Yeah.
out. Um, so yeah, I mean, these were kind of like the very first encounters with technology. I guess Sega Genesis was life changing for me. Just the fact that you could just put characters on a screen, um, manipulate them, build something fun was life changing.
Cool. Yeah, no, that resonates a lot. But I realized I forgot to ask you to introduce yourself. So maybe
Yeah.
for those that don't know you, I'm sure most people your watch have looked you up at least.
Hmm.
So, but yeah, can you give a quick intro to all the viewers?
Yep. So my name is Gonçalo. I'm from Porto, Portugal. I'm currently working remotely at Doist. We build Todoist and Twist. We've been doing this for a decade now. So before Doist, I freelanced, worked in other companies, and yeah, I'm generally an engineer at heart. Uh, and now I'm managing teams too.
Cool. Well, we'll have time to dig deeper, but now rolling back to where we were, you were talking
Hmm.
about the Sega, and I realized from what you were saying that you also had like programming experience before you went to college, right? Um,
Yes, I went to college. Although everything I just told you happened before
Yeah, so
college.
that's because I was gonna ask because I also went to college for computer science and a lot, not me particularly. I was never really a gamer in terms of video games. I like board games instead. But
Hmm.
I had friends that came into college into a computer science program with the idea of like I like video games, I like playing them, so I'm sure it'll be great making them and quickly realize that's not the case and drop off to go do something else. So
Yeah.
you knew what you were getting into when you went to college for computer science?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that by the time we got a computer, when I was about, I'm not entirely sure, somewhere between 10 and 12, it very quickly clicked for me on a non-gaming basis that that was like super fun. And if I could do that for a living, I would definitely want to do that. So yeah, I love tech, and I've realized that it's not only about gaming actually very early before college,
Hmm.
but I have the same experience. I think a key difference is even around gaming. Originally, for me, was it was not only about the game itself and the experience; it also fascinated me how that was done.
Hmm.
Right, so I think already kind of like trying to break down the product in front of you and figuring out what steps were taken to put things, the way they were, it's very much a programming trait. So
Hmm.
yeah, I think that was very helpful to
Cool.
kind of like
And
cement my
when
interest in tech.
in college, what was that experience like in terms of the learnings? Do you, looking back now, do you think it was worth it, or would you have taken a different route? Would you have known?
I think it was super worth it. I would do it again 100 times out of 100. I definitely see that you can build an awesome career and an awesome profile in software without college. Actually, I work with a lot of people like that. For me personally, it worked really well because it taught me things that I'm not sure I would otherwise learn, at least as quickly. So, for example, uh, the code I was writing before was really not good, and this focus that you get on writing good code and having stronger foundations like patterns, architecture, these things. What I cared about was shipping stuff, was doing stuff. I cared about the end product. I didn't care as much about the process of getting to the end product. And I think college really taught me to think about this process too. Um, it also exposed me to things that maybe didn't come as naturally because my experience was with C and Visual Basic, and suddenly um, I'm sure all colleges are different, but like where I went to, we were exposed to things like Scheme and Haskell and Prolog, and this really bent my mind for a while, thinking differently. But I think in the end, it really made me a better programmer in all of the environments, just knowing these. Um, and I mean, of course, like in college, you also explore things like software methodologies, waterfall, agile. These things are super useful. Even if you don't want to religiously use them, just being able to recognize them and see the faults. Again, it's something you can definitely learn on your own, but if you have the background, it helps a bit. It's like reading a book on a topic before experimenting with it versus not doing it. And I made a lot of good friends that I still have today in the software world. So
Mhm.
there's also a bit of the networking aspect to this. So yeah, I mean, again, it definitely works not going to college. I know a lot of really talented people in this context,
Mhm.
but for me, it was, I think, life changing. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And for context, obviously here in Portugal is much easier financially also to go to college. It's not
Yes.
such a burden as in other countries. Particularly, I'm thinking about the U.S. obviously.
Hmm.
But yeah, so moving on from college, I don't know if you have any particular thing you want to talk about in terms of your experience in college. I know you mentioned you're experimenting with Scheme and Prolog and some of these more exoteric languages, but is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even Erlang. But yeah, there's something else. Being in college or surrounded by software people also exposes you to interesting things. And actually, I would say it's fair to say my career kind of started with Ruby, particularly Ruby on Rails. And this was a college thing. So I was part of the students group.
Hmm.
Like, I don't know the English name for this, but anyway, we built something we did was build some products that were used internally in college. One of those was called Fipload. It was basically a mega upload thing.
Hmm.
Um, and this was started by a friend, a colleague, like colleague in college called Paulo, and he used Ruby on Rails. And I had never heard about this, but I really liked the product. I really liked the way it worked. So I kind of like joined forces and helped him grow the product and maintain it. And that's actually how I got into Ruby on Rails. So again, like I heard about Ruby on Rails rather early, I think, like about 4 years after the very first release, which was not a 1.0, was something else.
Hmm.
There was not a lot of people at the time. And again, it was through the network built in college. And even further, my first job out of college was a company that was founded by a college teacher. And I got to work in Ruby on Rails and also actually do a lot of open source as part of my job. Again, through a connect, something I learned because
Hmm.
of college, through a connection I made in college. And I think I learned and grew a lot in that job. It gave me a lot of flexibility to find my space in the community. And I'm very grateful because I realize not a lot of people have, this many opportunities. But I do attribute a lot of it to the context of college and colleagues, teachers, using things, showing things, trying new things, and being in this environment can be very enriching.
Yeah, that's pretty cool because it's really similar to the way I got into Rails. Was also kind of through colleagues in college, but it also rings true that in your experience in college, it wasn't necessarily the classes that you were taking, but more so the people that you were meeting and the discussions and things that happen outside of the classes that then shaped kind of your career moving forward, which is also true for me. So.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's both. There's the esoteric language thing, which is very much about classes and software methodologies. Then, but yeah, I mean, the takeoff of my initial career initially is definitely stuff that happened outside of the
Cool.
classes themselves, but in that environment. There is actually something I was forgetting, which was Ruby Summer of Code. I
Hmm.
was in Ruby Summer of Code, which also connected me to really cool people working in around Rails and Ruby, like Yehuda Katz, for example. And I got to do a lot of interesting work. At the time, it was around profiling Rails applications. So I worked on things like RubyProf and the benchmarking utils that were in Rails. And honestly, there was a lot of imposter syndrome around those projects and a lot of, I felt really underskilled compared to the people I was working with, but that was also like I think a really strong motivation to learn and get better. So there was also that like you couldn't go into Ruby Summer of Code without being a student. So
Right. Yeah.
yeah,
There's some good things there. Yeah, but moving on to later on in your career, you now mentioned you've been doing remote work, right? So you've been working remotely for the past 10 years or so at Doist. Um, so what's your take there on remote work? That's kind of a broad question, but I'll try to nail it down a little bit more. So nowadays, in this current situation we're all facing, remote work has been talked about at length, and more companies are looking at it as like a possibility, like something that you can actually work remotely.
hmm
So what's your take on that? I'm sure you're pro remote work, right? But like, what's your opinion on what you've been seeing lately?
Yeah, and remote work fits me perfectly. I never really fit into but I always had struggled with schedules. Not a morning person, never been. My energy levels are a bit unstable. It's not uncommon for me to kind of like produce a lot of stuff on a Saturday, but then don't do anything on a Monday. So remote work enables allows me to kind of like leverage my energy levels, leverage whatever schedule works for me, and this was a profound change for me. The thing we are seeing now is that there is an even larger change across the board for a lot of people because it means you can have lunch with your family, it means you can pick up your kids from school, it means you can have a beer with your friends in the afternoon, and that's fine. um, and I think a lot of people are realizing that it lets them have a higher quality of life, even things like you can live in a cheaper city and kind of like enjoy the nice things about not living in an expensive place.
Hmm.
And that's fine. It works. So I think it brings a lot of uniformity and transparency to the workplace. And I also think it's not for everyone. Obviously, there's a lot of jobs out there which are location dependent. But for knowledge workers, I really think we will see a future where remote work is very dominant. I mean, I wouldn't say it's going to be 100% for sure. There will always be a place for the office. There will always be people who prefer synchronous, in-person communication and working in that environment. But I do think it will be much less of a niche than it is now.
Hmm. So there's still, and even in the current situation, there's still companies that I see and talk to that still believe that in-person meetings and just being all together is what really generates creativity. So that's very important for the product team and stuff
Mm.
like that. Do you agree, or do you think there's is not black and white like that?
I definitely don't think it's black and white like that. Um, so I think there are a lot of trade-offs in in-person collaboration. Um, One, for example, you spend a lot of energy around ideas that you're going to discard at some point. Because the thing about synchronous communication is it's not the best version of the argument you want to make. If you want to make a good argument, if you want to add an idea, a well-founded idea to some discussion, you're going to need time to think it through, to think of the use cases, explain, your idea, do some deeper reasoning. If I'm talking to you in person, I will kind of like, shoot the first thing that comes to mind, and then try to kind of like work backwards from that, which is much more sloppy. Uh, Once I've kind of like changed my idea because it matured, I've already wasted your time listening to my kind of like preliminary thinking. Um, and I think it's very hard to avoid this when you're communicating synchronously. When you're communicating asynchronously, it's much different because you're thinking more in checkpoints. Like you say something, I will reply to you when I'm ready. And when I'm ready includes when I've thought it through, when I've kind of like written down what I think about something, I am able to edit myself. This is critical, right? Like I can go back to what I'm writing and change it, improve it. And so the signal in this conversation, which by the way is slower, I don't want to pretend like it's all good, like it's inherently slower, but the signal is much higher. So the thing that I have found personally is that when you're communicating synchronously, it feels like you're moving faster, and maybe you are if you think in the scope of an hour or two. But if you think in the scope of a day, or better, maybe a week, you actually move much faster with asynchronous communication because you're able to think things through properly as you take each step. There's less back and forth. And obviously, there's a lot more benefits to this, like documentation around discussions and ideas is much more thorough in this way because the discussion is richer. You can use that to build documentation, or even sometimes ignore documentation because the discussion is good enough and not messy. If you think back to the times when you discuss something in person, it's not documented, it's private. If you think about Slack, it's kind of messy, especially if other things are going on at the same time. So when you think about async and tools that enable asynchronous communication, and like I don't want to promote what we do, but you have discourse, you have threads, there are many products in this category. they are very focused and they really enable you. They don't have high bandwidth like in-person communication, but they have high signal. And that's kind of a win also for product teams and people in these kinds of jobs.
But do you think there's in the process of building a product or a feature for a product and thinking it out, do you think there's steps where the synchronous or even in-person communication is important, that step, and then okay, then let's move to asynchronous communication? Or do you think doing all asynchronous communication is gonna be better in the long run every time?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I don't think it's black and white. So I think fully asynchronous works, but it can be helpful to move back to synchronous in at least two scenarios. One, what you're trying to discuss is so complex or so abstract or so undefined that you're paralyzed. You can't write about it. You have no idea. So speaking about it might be easier to kind of like start forming what you're trying to write about. Another one is unblocking. Like sometimes discussing things asynchronously, you can get blocked because you have really good arguments on one side or another, and you're kind of like unable to move and find common ground. And this is something that you can much more easily do face to face. So those are at least two ways. And I mean, we also need to consider that we have evolved over so many years perfecting, real-time communication. This is how we communicate. This is how we have communicated ever since we became a species. So there are differences, very deep differences between these styles of communication, and we have become really good at synchronous communication. So that's also something we need to consider because, for example, emotionally, it can be hard to communicate asynchronous all the time. I do think that in a remote company, people need to have one-on-one with their managers on a recurring basis, and that these meetings should be very personal. Like, how are you feeling? Because the sense of isolation can be very strong in a remote company, and especially in an async company, because not only are you remote, you're not kind of online at the same time as your colleagues, or at least that's how it feels. So you need to think about ways of fighting back, and actually synchronous communication is a great way to connect.
Yeah. Yeah, because we were kind of throwing everything in the same bucket here, remote and asynchronous. It's not necessarily true, and in some cases, it's definitely
Yeah.
not true. So there's remote work and there's synchronous and asynchronous communication. All of this can happen, like you can mix and match. But before we get further, there was a keyword that triggered something for me there, that you said you get blocked, and I was thinking of blocking in a different way. So what happens when let's say I need some decision to move forward, and I'm blocked there, and now we're talking asynchronously, and maybe like you can't answer right now, which is fine in an asynchronous communication, and I need to wait 1 2 hours or more, or even to the next day, depending on the time zones,
Mm-hmm.
to get an answer, and now I can't do my job. Do you face that situation? How do you prevent it, or how do you circumvent it?
I think this is a bit inevitable, but there are a lot of things we do to prevent this. I think the most important is ownership. And this applies, I think, to most companies that want to do great work. You need to spread ownership over things. If you have if you need to wait for certain people to always move forward with decisions, you're going to be bogged down all the time. And I would argue this is not the best way to work. So, giving out ownership so that you're inherently less blocked because you have a lot of ownership over what you are doing at any point in time. Uh, Although this doesn't scale for everything, right? Like if you're an engineer and you need a design, you're not responsible for the design, the designer is. What I think is fundamental when you're working remotely and async is looking ahead and trying to prevent blocks from the get-go. So when you are, for example, when you know this situation will happen, maybe you're going to have the designer working on something for a couple days before the developer starts working on it, or they work on a consultation basis on the kind of like idea forming stage. This sounds a bit like waterfall, and it is, because there is a third thing we do, which is most people have kind of like a backlog of things to do. So it's not like you have one thing to do at all times and nothing else. There's a lot going on all the time in, I guess, all teams. You have whatever feature you're trying to build, you have a backlog of issues, you have a backlog of improvements your team wants to do. There's a lot of things. So we really kind of like, I think it's very important when working async to foster a culture of trying to context switch when it makes sense. So if you can't prevent a block, you try very hard so the blocks are few, but still you hit a block, you should be able to kind of like see what's the number 2 thing on your list and then kind of like go do that before you can move back to the number 1. So really trying to kind of like, flex the muscle of multitasking a bit can be very important for productivity in this regard.
Yeah, I was thinking if it ever happens that like you're talking asynchronously at some point, you say, okay, let's just hop into a call and just finish like iron this out because we're taking too long to reach an agreement. Does that happen?
Yes, very, very, very rarely. The thing is, we try to not be like, we loop in everybody. We work very strongly on a context of transparency, but we kind of like try to find consensus. So for every discussion, the decision ideally and often happens, there is kind of like a deadline. Like I want to decide this by the end of the week. So people kind of like points, and then the decision is made by the end of the week. So very rarely it's now people still jump on calls. Sometimes the discussions get heated. People are passionate about certain topics. They want to kind of like make sure their point of view is seen, and we do this in many ways. Bigger posts, jump on calls, but it's actually.
Got it. Okay. Well, can you hear me? I think there was some issue.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
No, it's good.
Yeah, no, it's back. Cool. So moving forward a little bit, changing the topic from remote to so you're the CTO at Twist, right?
Yeah.
So you manage people and technology. So first of all, the question I like to ask is what's the technology behind Doist and the products that you guys do?
Well, we have a lot of it because we are in multiple platforms. We have 2 products across various platforms. On the back end, we rely on Python, MySQL. We use Redis a lot to speed things up. We use Go for some microservices. So we have a monolith, but we have a few microservices. So it's a bit of a hybrid, but more on the monolith side of things. On the browser, we've just transitioned to TypeScript and we're using React. So that's our stack right now. Our stacks on mobile are very classical, like Kotlin, Swift. They are fully native apps. And we're working on desktop apps. We already have them out there, but we are actually going to leverage Electron moving forward. So that's not something we did before, but it's a bet we're going to make. Kind of like we want to build really great Electron apps, which, by the way, means we're not just going to wrap the web app. So we're trying to be tasteful and incorporate a few native touches and features into our Electron apps and get the best of both worlds.
What's the reason of the move to Electron? Since you already have assumingly like people with experience building native apps, why not just build also native apps for the desktop?
Yeah, this is purely strategical. Like, the truth is, building a native app is a lot of work. And we had native apps for Windows and macOS. And the truth is, they were good. We had a lot of users, but these platforms are not growing that much. We actually are seeing a strong migration to mobile. So strategically, it was becoming hard to justify having a dedicated team to do this, especially because it's not only that team. It has repercussions in support. Design has to design for more platforms. There's all sorts of costs around this. And at some point, it was purely strategical, trying to migrate to Electron, still being tasteful about it, seeing if we can get a very similar, we can give users similar value, but it's much more efficient for us.
Got it. And with all these different clients, what sort, like, how are you building your API? I'm assuming a REST API, but are you looking into other options?
If you're asking about GraphQL,
That's an
yes.
option. Yeah.
Yeah, we've looked into it. We want to work in that direction, but actually our APIs are not excellent. So we have a REST API, yes, but our main API and actually the API that our clients use is something very, I would say, custom. We call it the Sync API.
Mm.
And it's a bit, I mean, I say it's custom because, REST, you can get resources, specific resources. GraphQL, you can kind of like define the schema and get the data back, right? So like there's a lot of use cases around these things. But the way API was built was with the idea that we wanted all data in the clients, and then we just wanted to do partial updates. So you can think of it as an API that sends you everything when you first
Mm.
sync, and then has a system to give you partial diffs
Got
as
it.
you move along. And so it's kind of like very, very specialized for our and other technologies yet, because although I know this sounds kind of like weird and inelegant, but when there's that weird piece of technology you have that just well for
If you don't have
I
any.
can't hear you. Oh, okay,
Oh,
you're back.
I was gonna say, like, there's like, if there's no issue, then like just don't fix, right? If it's not broken, don't fix it. Um,
Yeah, yeah, that's
but
it. Like it provides the experience we want.
mhm,
So we could migrate to something else, but then we start bumping into, how would we support our current workflow with REST? Then we would need to kind of like orchestrate a lot of requests. It would be very messy. GraphQL would be much easier for the first sync, but how would we properly do the diffs afterwards? It would require us to kind
yeah,
of like rethink a bit of the architecture
for
around
sure.
this, and yeah, I mean, this doesn't feel justified with
Hmm.
something that actually
Yeah,
works
so
pretty well.
GraphQL has subscriptions. I don't know if that's like, that was my question, is how is that sync happening? The diffing. I'm assuming the diffing probably happens somewhere else, but then uh, is that like a WebSockets connection that's persistent and keeps pushing stuff, or is it the clients that request now give me an update? Is that how it works?
There both actually. So we have the WebSocket connection that gives you the updates in real time. We also have the kind of like the syncing. You can pull also on demand. The way it works for us is each sync has a token, and when you ask for more data, when you sync the next time around, you send this token. This tells the server what version of data did you have and what's the difference to the data that we have. So the server can send you a sync, yeah, like these objects are new, these were deleted, these were modified. Here's
Mm-hmm.
the data.
Got it.
They are just tokens. Like it's like each state in time has an ID basically.
Got it. Yeah, so one thing you mentioned about the tech stack is that it's in Go, and what was it? What else? Python, right?
In the backend,
Yeah,
Python, yeah.
Go and Python, which we've talked about this off camera, that it's not your preferred technologies, right? So
Yeah.
what was the deal there? Was it something that was already like that when you came in?
Yeah, it was already like this when I came in, and also like I think in the grand scheme of things, um, tech doesn't the specific tech you're using does not matter as much as long as it's a good tool for the job. And we know Python works in the server; it works well for many applications. It's just for me, it's just personal preference. I don't think it's a very elegant language. I don't think it's a very expressive language. I'm not a huge fan of the lack of a type system, and I think the type annotations in the newer Python are a joke. Like you can annotate an integer as a string, and that works. That bends my mind, but I think there's a lot of things in the language that I dislike. But I have used it in the context of work, and actually I have contributed to open source projects which are written in Python. So it's not like I'm Python averse, but if I was going to start a project in the backend, I would definitely pick something like Ruby or Elixir or Kotlin. Very, very low
Mm-hmm.
on my list.
So, with that being said, how did you manage to go through the microservice craze, and not build everything new in microservices in the technology that you like.
I must say, like, I really love our engineering team around these topics because I think there is a lot of skepticism, which is healthy, in my opinion. The thing is, like, tech goes and comes and goes. We have waves of things, waves of ideas. Microservices, there was a huge craze, but it's not the first time we talk about modularizing things that are totally independent and can be built by different people, different teams. This has been discussed before, although we didn't call it microservices. The thing that happened for us mostly was that we kind of also not believe in like full rewrites. I know there's a lot of companies out there that kind of like every few years they like stop everything and build a new version, or they build it in parallel. And there's a lot of jokes about that too, because you need to multiply by 2.5 how much time you think
Mm-hmm.
this will take. We try to embrace a culture of continuous improvement. So, and that's what we do. So we don't care about big improvements. We care about improving just every day a little bit and things. If our architecture is lacking, we discuss how to improve it. Maybe we even adopt a new pattern. And then we just make sure that every new pull request comes in with a new pattern. And over time, we're going to converge on the new architecture. Um, so basically, we approach everything like this. For example, in the mobile platforms, our apps are very old. On mobile, 2012 was the first version that we released. They were being developed before that. Testing sucked in mobile in those years. It was really an afterthought, even when it worked at all. So we bolted text testing later on. And again, like, we didn't have this crazy month long or half a year long initiative of testing everything. At some point, we decided we wanted to improve this. And what we did was we agreed that every pull request needed to maintain or increase test coverage. For a while, that was all we did. So literally, you only needed to make sure that whatever code you were adding was tested to kind of like comply. It was not very forceful.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're working with code that lasts 13 years, Todoist backend and frontend are 13 years old today. I really believe this is the best strategy for your long-term success, for making sure that you're not working in bursts. Consistency is very important. So if you're always improving a little bit and you're kind of like paying off technical debt as you are accruing it, is a much better strategy than move fast, adopt the newest technology in 4 or 5 years. Everything sucks. It's a mess. You kind of like rewrite again. Um, it's a much more chaotic strategy. And yeah, it doesn't lend itself too much to consistency, which if you're building a product like we are, you want to build something great, you want to ship often, you want to improve often. You can't go through those
Mm-hmm.
cycles. So you need a better strategy, and that's what we try to focus on. So we survived the microservices craze by doing what we always do. We actually added a couple of microservices at the time, although we have, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 in total. So it's not like a real microservices architecture. And that's it. They are very focused. I wouldn't even call them microservices, just services. And we did it like we always do. We did it slowly. And then by the time we maybe could be risking more, the problems started cropping up in the community. We learned together and we realized, okay, we didn't heavily invest into this. And actually, maybe we shouldn't have anyway.
Cool. One thing though, I think the counterpoint to that is, and playing a bit of the devil's advocate here, but so if you're only always doing small, consistent.
I can't hear you, Zamith. Hmm. I heard if you're always only
Yep.
doing, and then I lost you.
But you can hear me now, right?
You're
Yeah.
back. Yeah,
So
you're back. Yeah,
I don't
okay.
know what's happening here, but anyway, so if you just do these small incremental changes, then you might miss out on a big architectural change. So if you want to do something, try something completely different, bigger, or try a completely different avenue of thought. How do you approach that? Do you just never do it, and that's fine, or like how do you approach that?
We don't generally do that. What we do is sometimes when we are starting something new, For example, we built Twist in 2000. We started building Twist in 2014, so 7 years after Todoist. We have also had other stuff like internal services, internal platforms, internal dashboards. We kind of like often use that as an exploration ground for ideas that we have. But I'll be honest, there was never a time where we thought, oh man, it's totally worth stopping for how many months and redoing everything in this. Because even when things look better, the cost benefit of doing that versus just slowly moving in the right direction has never seemed like it paid off for us. There are exceptions though, not many, but an example I can give is when we did decide to adopt TypeScript on the front end, a team member was so kind of like excited by this that they kind of like almost single-handedly converted most of the code base in about a week and a half, which was insane. I mean, I don't understand how we did that, but sometimes change happens very fast but it was totally accidental. Again, the plan was at the time to just write TypeScript, whatever new needed to be TypeScript. If you made a bigger refactoring, convert to TypeScript. That was the plan. But honestly, I want to kind of like push back a little bit more even into this idea, which is if you think on a long enough scope, like the one we're working in, 13 years, hopefully 13 more, time moves by very fast. So the Apple team started the Swift conversion about, I don't know, 3 years ago, announced. And I think using this strategy, they were, not over 90% of the code base in Swift after less than 2 years. So, the thing about continuous improvement is that it compounds. It's something we don't realize, but as long as you never compromise on this, you're going to make a very big change after a while. So it's just something to keep in mind because it might seem slow, but I would maybe say that this would not make sense, but if the Apple team decided to stop development of new features to rewrite everything in Swift, they would probably take almost as long as they did. So it's kind of interesting how these things play out for us.
Cool. In terms of the architecture, because obviously Todoist, or not obviously, but I'm assuming there's a bunch of events of like things that are triggered. And my question is, have you looked at or do you guys run an event-based architecture, or do you have anything like that, like event sourcing or any architecture like that?
Yeah, we use a lot of events on the back end, but actually it's a bit of a mess because we don't have a unified structure. It's one of those things that it's continuously improving. Actually, Todoist is old enough that Flask, which is currently a super popular Python Python framework, it didn't exist. So, and Django was too strict and too immature at the time we started. So actually, Todoist uses an in-house framework, which is very, very similar to Flask in philosophy, in the way it works, and even some of the naming, which is interesting because Flask was released 2 years later. So, but yeah, there's not a lot of structure there, and actually we're struggling a little bit with lack of architecture in the backend. That's something we're improving right now. So we've been doing some research, trying to find a direction to go in the future. But then again, this is one of the things I don't like in Python, in the Python way of doing things in the Python community. And this is obviously very personal, but I think there's inherently a lack of structure that you don't find in Rails or like Ruby, Rails. It's very opinionated. Things in Ruby is okay for the web. Things in Rails are very opinionated. Things in Ruby, people like to do things in a very structured way. This is the same is true for a lot of other languages. Elixir, for example, Erlang. I've worked with Erlang. There's a lot of expectations on how things should be structured and work. Python is more of the hacker language, kind of like, you do things, it's very easy, you ship very fast, and then you have a monster after some point. And I'm not saying you can't do things in a structured way with Python. You absolutely can. But it's not very inviting. It's not the community way of doing things. And that's, I think, very detrimental in the long term, unless you have somebody on the team who's very passionate about architecture and ensures there is some sort of direction. And this is something, admittedly, we came late into this realization that our backend was not going to scale much more without more structure than what we had. Like, I don't know.
How big is the Doist team right now?
We're about 80 people. Engineering, we're almost 40. We are structured in functions. So we're kind of like a functional company. We have an Android team, Apple team, integrations team, backend team, infrastructure team, design team, etc. We have about 5 to 6 people per team. So it's not constant, and there are some variations, but you can look at it as 5 to 6 people per team. Although we've grown quite a bit in the last 2 years. Before that, we were about 3 people, 2 to 4 people, depending on the team. So
Got it.
yeah.
So I have a couple of questions there in terms of your organization as you grew, because you've been there for so long, so you've probably seen it grow from far less than that into these 80 people, 40 people on the product team. So what challenges did you have in terms of communications as you scaled? In terms of communication, I mean, as you scaled.
I mean, there's just so many challenges. So communication is very hard, and I think we've went through a lot of things. So, for example, we started remote. We've been remote from the start. Actually, the first version of Doist was very interesting because Amir thought that he could build a great company with just using freelancers. So he would just hire people to do things and build a product in that way. He realized that didn't work, so he ended up hiring people, but it was remote. He was in Chile. He hired people in the US. He hired me in Portugal. There was people in Denmark. So it was remote from the beginning. The first hurdle we had, communication related, but more generally too, was there was a boom at Doist in the beginning where, network effects, and that we started hiring a lot of people from Porto. So there were our first designer, Anna, was somebody I had worked with before. Our first Apple developer, actually not our first, but our current, was somebody I had worked with before. And we have more examples like this, and it spread. And this created a bit of a problem because at some point in the company's history, there were a lot of people in Porto. And that was the first time we kind of like tasted the hybrid structure where there was some communication happening in Porto and some communication happening more openly. And we didn't even realize how damaging it was being to the company because we were losing transparency. We were not involving people at the right times into conversations, and it all felt natural. So I think that broke off over time as we kept hiring more people abroad. Amir even spent some time here, which didn't help, and he left. Was as a remote company, we need a lot of transparency. We need to make sure we're communicating in a way that's inclusive. And if we're not careful, that does not happen. And that's, for example, one of the reasons I'm very, very skeptical when I hear things from the Valley, where people talk about having the leadership in the Valley and then hiring remotely everywhere else. And I think that's insane. That's the worst version of it all. I mean, just go back to the office. It's better. Because when you create first and second class employees, you have a big problem in terms of incentives. Your incentives are completely misaligned.
Do you think you can create, sorry to interrupt, but do you think you can create a product team that's all remote and not remote, but let's say you have a product team that's co-located or remote, doesn't really matter. And then you have the non-product team like sales teams, management team that's in the valley, as you were saying, or somewhere else. But you have the entire product team is working together in the same place, for example. Do you think that works?
I don't think so. The problem is the problem I see with this is I'm sure you're thinking of the sales team and the management team as being independent from the product team, but it's not quite true because the sales team is trying to sell what the product team is doing, and there are communication bridges there and stakeholders and expectations.
Sure.
Same thing with management. They are managing. I assume you were talking about leadership. They're kind of like managing the company. The problem with hubs is you do a lot of informal communication outwards. For example, if you have the product team co-located, you start brainstorming with an idea, what's our focus for next year? And when you end, you have a plan with months and milestones and stuff. And when you present this outwards, it becomes very hard to challenge because people were not part of the process. They did not follow up on the process. So the ideas are very well defined. And especially for the people who have already discussed this, it feels like it's done. It's not done until it's done, basically. So I'm not saying you can't do this. I'm saying it needs a lot of intentional decision making to make it work, to make sure that people don't feel like second class employees, to make sure that processes are transparent and that nobody's kind of like left out, which is very easy if you're in a hub. Just talk to your teammate next to you and, not communicate openly. I think it's very challenging. Honestly, I think it's much easier to make remote work and to make co-located work. I think from my experience, I'm fully remote now, fully async. I have worked in an office before. We had that period of hybrid, which was a bit accidental. It was by far the worst and most challenging we have ever dealt with because it's very hard to deal with without rules that don't necessarily make sense to you. What do I mean by this? If I have to communicate with my team now, I will default to open and transparent because I'm alone here and I want to communicate with people. That makes sense. If I have my team in the same room as I am, but there is a rule that I should communicate openly, it feels weird. Like, why don't I just talk to people? So hybrid lends itself to a bit of a struggle and a bit of things that seem nonsense that are detrimental. So again, not saying this won't work. There are certainly approaches to this. I think Stripe is doing something really interesting with their hubs. I don't know if you're kind of like into this, but Stripe has big hubs in many places around the world. And their newest hub is a remote hub. The thing is, in Stripe, hubs are very autonomous. So that's just how they are structured, and I hope it works for them, but it's a very interesting take on the hybrid approach. But again, it's conscious. It's clear they have thought about things. They have thought things through. They're trying to make sure that they don't alienate themselves, that they don't create unnecessary challenges for themselves.
Cool. So for in Doist, what's the team structure like? You mentioned you have like the Apple team, the what else? The Android team, but who belongs to these teams? I'm assuming developers and designers, but do you also have QA people, product managers? Like, what's the composition of the teams?
It's a functional structure. So in the Android team, there are only Android engineers. In the Apple team, there are only Apple engineers. In the design team, there are only designers, and so on. The sales team only has salespeople. The thing is, we are structured in this way. We give total ownership to the teams over their own domain. So the Android team is responsible for making sure we have one of the best Android apps in the store, for example. Obviously, we don't work like this, because you need all of these disciplines to make things happen. So what we do is we use something we call squads, not to be confused with the Spotify squads. It's a bit different. But basically what this means is we have monthly long work cycles, just because it helps us reason about things. There is nothing special about that duration. And during this time, there's things we want to do, features we want to build, improvements we want to do. And the thing we do is we kind of like assemble cross-functional teams that we call squads that tackle and own something around this. So when we want to build a feature, we get somebody from the backend, from Android, Apple, a designer. We kind of like give them the piece of work, very unspecified. We like working in this way. So just the bulk of the idea, what problem it's solving. It's like a one-page thing. And then they figure it out. They own this. They own the execution, and they just collaborate together. Next month, they will disassemble and kind of like work with different people again. This is another cool way of breaking down the barriers of remote work and making sure that most people work with most other people on a regular basis. Sure. Yeah, so that's basically how we work.
And who comes up with these ideas, or how is that process like?
Yeah, so we try to have a very transparent and democratic workflow. So we have this channel on Twist called Do Ideas. Everybody can like propose things and pitch them and lobby for them. That's something we actually encourage for everybody to be involved with this. But obviously, it's not random. We usually have themes around 1 year, sometimes even longer. For example, we just finished a strike of improving what we call Todoist foundations, which are kind of like our foundational features, like search and scheduling. We kind of like reworked all of them. We're entering into a cycle where we want to improve collaboration on
Mm-hmm.
Todoist. And these themes, overall high-level themes, help us pick what to do. Because now that we're working on collaboration, we're kind of like going to focus more on the things that affect collaboration and disregard others a bit more. We never go all in. We try to balance things, but it's a focus. So we pick from ideas that people propose. We pick from user requests. The theme itself is this. We discuss together, by the way. It's not like he says now the theme is
Mm-hmm.
ABC,
Yeah.
but he usually proposes something. There's a discussion, some pushback. Actually, usually there are deeper changes after he gets feedback from everybody else. And that's how we do it. And then we just focus on that theme, scope things,
Mm-hmm.
and start
But
doing it.
that picking of like the pitch, like there's pitches, there's ideas, but like someone has to go through all of them and decide. So that's up to like you and like upper management that decide. And also like, is there like a product manager that then is gonna be like making sure, or I don't know, product man. I don't like this name, like product manager, product owner, or whatever. It all seems very confusing to me. Like, but
Yeah.
have someone that is then ensuring that you're going on the right path.
We have a team. So we have a team that's comprised of product people. I'm there. Our head of design is there, and we kind of like hash it out together. So again, in the open, so everybody can weigh in, and when people are passionate about ideas, they can push for them. But ultimately, it's our responsibility to prioritize, make sure we prioritize within reason, and that prioritization makes sense, and that balance the needs. Like design has needs, engineering has needs, right? Like we need to refactor. There's things that are our recently our billing was a mess, in terms of structure and code. So we really wanted to revamp that. It was an internal project. So we basically get together and decide together. We compromise together. We rely a lot on collaboration to make sure all the needs are catered for, but that we still remain strategic, right? Like if we don't ship, if we don't improve our products, our products are our bread and butter. We're bootstrapped. We rely on our revenues 100%. So we need to always be improving. That's something we look at relentlessly.
Cool. So Gonçalo, I think we would had topics here for many more hours of conversation, but unfortunately we've reached almost the hour mark. Is there anything you'd like to talk about, promote, or I don't know, the time is
Yeah, I
yours.
mean, there's not much. I'm not really into social. Twitter is the only thing I kind of use. So if you want to discuss or find me somewhere, that's there.
Hmm.
I have a LinkedIn I don't use. I don't have Facebook or anything like that. Doist has a really cool blog. So if people are interested in remote work, asynchronous communication, how we do things, we have an amazing blog managed by amazing people. I really think it's of signal there. I would recommend people who are interested in these topics to visit. Um, and yeah, I mean, I know this is a technical, more technical, typically more technical interview. Um, I really think it's cool that technology enables us to do the things we do. And if there's kind of like one piece of advice I want to leave before this ends is we don't have to be married. Ultimately, we're kind of like producing value for somebody, for ourselves sometimes, but sometimes for other people, and that's really the focus. I think there's a lot of religion around technology, and I think when we tone that down a little bit, we all win. So yeah, and I think Duist is a great example. I'm hugely not a fan of the technology we use in the backend. We didn't talk about Go. I also don't like Go, so there's that.
Yeah, we don't have time for that for sure. Um, and anyway, thanks so much again for taking the
Thank you.
challenge and for sharing like just all of these like learnings from many years working at Doist, and I think it was super interesting. Hopefully you liked it as well. And yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, everyone. That there was another edition of Subvisual Live Talks. Thanks for watching, and if you haven't, check us out on any of these Social networks, Twitch, that's where we stream, but we're very active on Twitter as well. So if you want to check out what's happening with Subvisual and to know more about Subvisual Live Talks, don't forget to subscribe in any of these channels, like, share, all those things. That really helps us keep going. So please don't forget that. Thank you, and see you next week.